Afternoon folks, Mark here. Welcome to my sofa. I'm joined today by a very special guest, a half-finished project I never completed. So, in this series, I'm going to attempt to turn this into a Necron combat patrol. Let's go spill some paint.
In aeons long past, the Kemet dynasty occupied a series of bleak ocean worlds, ruled by the ruthless Pharaoh Amokem. In fear of the destroyer curse that was spreading through the Pharaoh's court, rivals struck as the Kemet went into stasis. They bombarded the Kemet worlds, split open their tombs, and shattered their control systems, leaving the oceans to bury the remains. But even the crushing depths couldn't rid the universe of the Kemet. The drowned tombs stir again, the curse of rage rising with them.
Obviously that's an excuse to fill my army with a lot of destroyers, which means I can mostly avoid painting large units. I went for the new Scorpec Lord as my HQ, leading a unit of his smaller friends, backed up by a Hexmark destroyer and 3 Ophidian destroyers. Then I remembered I had to take at least one core unit. Immortals or warriors then. Immortals meant less models, but neither were really a good fit for the lore. Until they became the latest unit to begin the transformation into destroyers, giving them a reason to be there, me an excuse to wheel out the 3D printer, and letting me pretend I had an all-destroyer army. After a whole lot of messing about in Blender, I managed to build a new spine that looked a little bit more like the Hexmark, and some new heads that were reminiscent of Hexmark and the old destroyers, which are now Locust destroyers. Bit of printing, bit of cleaning up, a little bit of finessing when I tried to assemble everything because I hadn't got it quite right, and there we go. 5 Immortals currently succumbing to the destroyer curse and in the early stages of transformation. All they needed now was a few millennia under the ocean adding to them. I started with some barnacles. Technically, they'd grow on top of everything else, but it's much easier this way around. All they are is a tiny ball of green stuff squidged into a rough cone, some ridges pressed up the sides, and a quick poke in the top. They look good in clusters rather than evenly scattered about the model. Maybe be a bit more careful than me, though, so you don't end up having to redo them after a wayward finger. While the barnacles cured, I could work on the coral. I've done this before, so I didn't anticipate any problem. I clipped off some random chunks of sprue, and I stuck them to the rest of the sprue to give me a solid base to work off. Then all I needed was a candle, a metal spike, which I made from a piece of brass wire in the end of a pin vise, and some care and delicacy. All you do is heat the wire up in the candle flame, and then press it into the sprue firmly. Then I remembered the first thing I did last time was quickly and gently run a flame over the bits of sprue, just to soften the edges. The other option is to cover all of it in a thin layer of plastic glue first, let that soften the structure of the material, and then start trying to press in the dents. And when none of that works, you get a bigger candle, and you try it again with more heat. And when all else fails, resort to milliput. Mix it together, rip off a chunk, squidge it in place, and then just poke at it. As a finishing touch, I used pumice paste just to smear about, make everything messier, and kind of splodge it all in together. You don't have to be particularly accurate, which makes this even more fun. Then I changed my mind and realised that actually they needed a little more battle damage and weathering, so I went back over them with a knife, some files, and the side of a drill bit just to kind of gouge in and core out various bits, take an eye out here and there, that kind of thing. One quick trip past the airbrush later and they're primed, then base coated in a mix of leather and dark browns. On top of that, I stippled... On top of that, I stippled mahogany, a dark flesh tone, and some orange so they looked suitably rusty. To pick out the main shapes, though, I needed to shade the undersides and joins of the various blocks. I used a dark brown initially, and then pushed it further with some purple ink to really define the forms. They weren't going to go anywhere totally rusted up, though, so I went back with some steel and silver metallics to unrust the pistons and hinges that would see the most movement. On top of that, I added a quick coat of the attractively named Oil Discharge ink to give a suggestion of lubrication in the joints. I wasn't going to leave them just rusty, though, so then I moved on to their armour. That was going to be green marble, because, like always, I picked a fun-sounding idea without thinking about the reality of having to paint it over and over and over. After painting the armour black to cover up the random rust colours, I painted patches of dark and mid-green unevenly over the panels, finishing up with a mix of green and a blue-grey tone. With that done, I could go back and add in some veins of that same blue-grey. Then I just needed to do it again, glazing down with the greens, and this time using both the blue-grey and pure white as veins to sharpen them up. You just have to keep doing that until the effect's built up as much as you want. It does take time to build up, but the effect is worth it. What I should have done next was some shading and highlights on the marble, but I got distracted thinking about how to paint the cables, so they were next. I decided I wanted them to look like optical fibre, so I started with black before tinting the ends with purple, fuchsia pink, and light blue to mimic the end glow of fibre optics. Once that was done to my liking, I finished the cables off with some thin white lines where external light would catch to make them shine. I did the same for the eyes because I didn't want to add any more colours to the mix. The gun barrels got the same treatment as the cables, except the shape made my life difficult. I kept the grooves brighter so that the colour was more obvious, and added tiny highlights to the front edge of each of the dots on the barrel. For the vents in the main gun body, I decided to speed the process up and paint them purple before washing pink and then blue into them so it would flow into the recesses each time. While the pink wash dried, I did the final white highlights on the barrels. I was careful to try and work out where the light would catch on the complex shapes. Looking at the final effect, though, I wasn't happy. It was messy and confusing to the eye, so I picked up another model and tried again, this time not using washes as a shortcut. I painted the vents white and worked down to purple on the outer edges of the veins. The gun barrels were painted up the same way as before, only this time I decided to simplify the white highlights, only doing the top rear edges of the bottom blocks and the front edges of the upper blocks. Less accurate to real life, but much easier to read at small scale. That left me with a few stray cables and the chest emblem that I had no plan for. I spent far too long thinking about it, and then I remembered some useful advice. If it doesn't matter, just paint it black, which I did, mixing in a beige-brown highlight for a quick and dirty, aged look. It was finally time to finish off the marble, glazing in black for the shadows and highlighting with thin layers of white glaze, a less opaque white that won't cover the green up as much. While I was at it, though, I also brightened up the rust with a mix of orange and white glaze, because it was looking a little flat. And that just left the ocean grime, starting with the barnacles again. Given how small they were, the barnacles actually took a little bit of time. They started out as blue-grey. I then highlighted this with a mix of white and flesh tones, washing and glazing it down with a dark blue, before retouching the highlights right at the very tip. I base-coated the rocky areas with a dark uniform green. On top of that, I used a wet dry brush of khaki, and then a slightly drier wet dry brush of off-white. To separate between the rock and the coral, I then glazed a dark red over the coral areas to give them a different hue, and to finish it off, added small touches of a yellow glaze on just the highlights of those areas. I ended up going back at the end with some brown ink, just to break up the kind of main bulk a little bit and darken a few of the key shadows. And with that, the first unit of my combat patrol were finished. Okay, so it's probably kind of obvious they're not actually finished. Since I filmed that, they've actually gone back onto their little scraps of plywood for a couple of coats of gloss varnish. Don't worry, they'll get their bases done eventually. I'm just saving that part of the plan for when I've got all the models done and I can base everything at once. Which means we'll leave it there. 5 models down, 8 to go. Next time, I'll focus on the score pack because they're already built. So, if you can bear another episode, I'll see you then. Except I won't, because I'm staring at a camera, and YouTube doesn't work that way.